Okay, so the author of Hebrews, a couple of chapters ago, back in chapter 5, first introduced us to this mysterious figure of Melchizedek. So last week, when we started chapter 7, he began his more detailed analysis of the personality of Melchizedek, who he was, and what he meant. What his significance is to his topic here in Hebrews. And so in the first 3 verses last week, as you remember, he introduced us essentially to who Melchizedek was, how he entered into the story of God's people. And just as a very brief reminder, as we lead into the next verses, that Abraham, but back in Genesis, Abraham met Melchizedek after essentially the battle of the 5 armies, when these armies had gone to battle against the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and some other cities, and had taken Lot and a bunch of other people, Abraham's nephew Lot, and a bunch of other people captive, and plundered a bunch of goods and food and all this kind of stuff. And so, in the original version of the movie 300, Abraham goes with about 321, something like that, people, soldiers, and in the cover of night surprises the armies and rescues Lot and all the other captives and brings back all the plunder. So, and I said last week it would make a really great movie, and it really would. It was a very interesting story, and it needs to star Gerard Butler as Abraham.
Yes, please. If I can't have Chris Hemsworth, give me Gerard Butler.
Okay, either one of those would work.
Yes.
That's a tagline. You're in a whole lot of trouble now.
Yes. Abraham was the original 300. Okay, even before the Spartans.
Yeah.
But anyway, so when he came back after that victory, and he met Melchizedek then, the king of Salem. He was a priest and a king. And Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and they had a celebration, and they gave him kind of a big celebration party thing. But then Abraham paid tribute to Melchizedek, gave him a tenth of all the spoils that he had recovered after this rescue and after this battle. And so he paid tribute to Melchizedek with the tenth. So that was kind of the whole point of him, of the author of Hebrews bringing up Melchizedek, was he wanted to point out those 2 significant actions, that Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and that Abraham paid this tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. And that was the 2 aspects, well, 3 if you count the meaning of his name, Melchizedek, but that was what we talked about last week. What we're going to talk about this week is the reason that he wanted to focus on those 2 actions, the blessing of Abraham and the tribute paid to Melchizedek, is because it's going to lead into his next point. And the whole focus of it, and the whole reason I believe that he brought up Melchizedek to start with, is because it feeds into his overarching narrative, his overarching principle that Christ is our great high priest, and that he's a superior high priest to all the previous human high priests that we had before in the law. And so that's where this figures in, talking about the superiority of the priesthood, the order of the priesthood that Christ is a part of. So, in these verses 4 to 10 of chapter 7, we're going to talk about Melchizedek the Greater, the aspect of his greatness, or the superiority, you might say, of his status, position, nature over Abraham. And we're going to see why that matters in these verses. So, he starts out in verse 4, just think. And I want to just stop there and just talk about that word for just a minute. Just think. In the King James Version, it's translated, consider this. Remember way back when in chapter 5, when he first brought up Melchizedek, he immediately stopped right after bringing up Melchizedek and said, this is going to be some hard things I need to talk about. And then that's when he stopped and said, but I don't think you guys are spiritually mature enough to understand them. And then he went on that whole thing in the last part of chapter 5 and chapter 6 about spiritual maturity. Because his whole point was he was going to go into some challenging things, and he wasn't sure they were up to it. Well, this is kind of where we're getting into those challenging things. And he wants us to consider or think about what he's about to do. And what he's about to do is he's about to stretch their thinking. He's wanting them to kind of step outside their mental box and really make some logical connections. It's kind of a, and when I say this, I don't mean this in a negative way, I mean this in an intellectual way. It's kind of a stretch because he's going to go through a series of arguments that are like A plus B and then B plus C kind of things to arrive at a conclusion. So that word in the Greek that's translated just think is the Greek word theorio. It means to look at something closely, to behold, to consider, or to perceive. Now a lot of times when you see a Greek word that starts with T-H-E-O, what's that?
Yourself.
Oh, I thought I was getting a text from God or something.
You're not telling this correctly.
I know, really, stop, shut up!
That's the wrong Greek word.
But T-H-E-O, you normally think of that as being, as having to do with the Greek word theos, which means God, where we get words like theology from and that sort of thing. But in this case, it's not. I mean, the similarity in the spelling in the Greek is just, it's just a similarity. It's not the same Greek word. This Greek word theorio actually is where we get our English word theory or theorize. So you think about what a theory is. The idea of a theory is that it's a series of postulates that someone comes up with to describe or explain a phenomenon. And then part of science is then to test those postulates to see if they're true, and that's when a theory becomes, fact or proven. But the theory part of it is that coming up with an explanation to describe some phenomenon that you're observing. So in a spiritual way, in a theological way, that's exactly what the author of Hebrews is here to do. He's here to take us down a logical train of thought, to postulate a theological theory, you might say, that he's going to then come back and use as a proof of his greater spiritual point of the superiority of Christ. So this is basically a thought exercise, a theological exercise, an analysis to determine what it might mean that Abraham paid the tribute to Melchizedek and that Melchizedek blessed Abraham. So he says, just think, first of all, how great he was. So what the author is wanting us to think about is this magnitude of this great status, the status essentially of Melchizedek. A lot of times when we see the English word great, we think of it might be the Greek word megas, where we get mega, the prefix mega from, that means great big, That's not actually the Greek word here either. It's actually a kind of an idiomatic expression in the Greek. This is a good translation. It's just to say, how great this person is. It's an expression that describes the greatness of like a king. Oh, just think how great he is. The idea behind this expression is to focus on the dignity of the one that's being described and their greatness. And like I said, normally you think about it the way you would describe a king. So how great he was that even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now this is a significant first point for the author to make, because he's talking again to Jews. Jewish Christians, but Jews. Jews who are, while they're Christians, they have come under this temptation to revert back to the law. We've been talking about that as the subtext since the beginning of this book. And so he's talking to them from the cultural perspective of the Jewish religion, of Judaism, and of the law. Well, for a Jew, there was no one greater, no man greater than Abraham. Abraham was the father of the nation of Israel. And even though they revered, of course, Moses as well, Moses himself was a descendant of Abraham. Abraham was the father of the nation. So from a human perspective, as far as men, there was no one greater than Abraham. So his first point is to point out that if Abraham, who is the father of the nation, and as great as we revere him as Jews, he paid tribute to the king of Salem, Melchizedek, what must this say, relatively speaking, about the greatness of Melchizedek? So that's his first point. Now, in verse 5, he goes a little bit deeper into the Jewish law. And again, he goes kind of back to this point in order to develop a later point. He says the law requires something of the descendants of Levi. Now, these Jewish Christians, again, they become very concerned with or obsessed with continuing to observe the law. That's, again, the subtext of why he wrote Hebrews. Because they've been falling back on a desire or an obsession to observe the law. So now the author of Hebrews is going to use a requirement of that very law to demonstrate his point about the superiority of this new priestly order. So he brings up the Levites and their descendants. And so the law required the descendants of Levi who became priests to collect a tenth or a tithe from all the people. So it was the Levites that God ordained amongst the people to be the priests. They would have a specific office and a specific duty to serve the people and to serve God. And it says they were to collect a tithe. That's where we get the word tithe from. It's just a word that means a tenth of something. In the Greek, this word tenth is dekade, which means a tenth part. It's where we get our you see it in English a lot of times in the prefix DEC, like in decimal. The word decimal is basically a way to express fractions in tenths of a whole. And that's what the decimal system essentially is. We see it in the word decimate. A lot of times we hear the word decimate and we think that means to utterly destroy something. And it does mean that, but technically it means to chop something up into tenths. And that's what decimate means. You also see it in the metric system, like a decimeter is a tenth of a meter. You know, we see a lot of that. But it comes from this Greek word dekade, which means a tenth part. But anyway, this collecting a tenth from the people, the purpose of this was essentially in support not only of the tabernacle and later the temple, but of the priesthood themselves. You should remember when the tribes came into the land, they divided the land up amongst all of the tribes, and all the tribes got a piece of the land that they could, grow their crops on, raise their livestock, build their houses, and all of that. But the Levites were not given any land. That's because they were called to serve in the temple. And therefore they couldn't raise, they couldn't go out and plant crops. They couldn't raise livestock. They couldn't go out and become carpenters and earn their own money. There had to be a way to support the work of the tabernacle and the temple and for the priesthood themselves. And so that was the purpose behind the tithe or the tenth that the people would have to bring of their stores, because they were all given land and the Levites weren't. So they were to give a portion of theirs to the Levites, and that would support the tabernacle and it would support the Levites. It was essentially their income tax, because this was a theocracy, and so it was basically their income tax. So it was for the support of the priests. So they wouldn't have to worry about farming or laboring in some other way. They could just focus on serving the people and serving God. So the Levites became priests and collected their tenth or tithe from the people. And then he goes on to point out this other thing about the Levites. That is their brothers. In other words, the Levites were collecting these tithes from their brothers. So even though the people were required to pay this tithe for the Levitical priests, they were still equal as brothers before God, because they were all descended from the same Abraham. They were essentially, cousins, to each other. Bless you.
Thank you.
They were basically, distant cousins of each other. So they were collecting tithes from each other, but they were brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. So they were just as much the children as Abraham, the people were just as much the children of Abraham as were the Levites, yet the Levites still collected these tithes from the people. Okay? So why is he mentioning all this? Well, again, he's getting to a point. He's making a logical case. So he begins to make this case in verses 6 through 8, where he contrasts this with Melchizedek. He's talked about Abraham and the Levitical priest. Now he's going to go back to talk about Melchizedek again. And he says, this man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi. Now we mentioned this before, but he was not a descendant of Levi, or Aaron, or even Abraham. He was from a totally different line. He was not of the line of Abraham. He was not a Jew. He was not one of the children of Israel. And yet, the author tells us, he collected a tenth from Abraham. So this man who was not from the Levitical line collected this tithe from Abraham. So what does this say about Melchizedek's importance? Then he adds one other thing, and this is the other point that I mentioned in the beginning. He collected a tithe from Abraham, and he blessed him who had the promise. So on top of receiving this tithe from Abraham, he blessed Abraham. And he points out, blessed him who had the promises. What he's focusing on is, remember, this is Abraham who had been chosen by God to receive the covenant. And this covenant that would say, I'm going to make of you a great people. I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to bless, all the earth will be blessed through your descendants. Through your descendant, the Messiah. So Abraham was the recipient of this covenant, of these promises. And yet, Melchizedek pronounced a blessing upon him. So what does this say about the importance of Melchizedek? Well, this is the author of Hebrews' point. Without a doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. And you see, that's the point of his comparison. He's making this cultural assumption, well, it's a cultural truth for him, that the one who gives a blessing is greater, either in power, and dignity, and importance, and resources, or whatever, than the one to whom the blessing is given. And really, to some degree, that's still true today. When we talk about, for example, like if, a young man wants to go and get married, and so he asks the blessing of the girl's father, And if and the father gives the blessing for them to get married, it's meaningful to them. And so why is that important? Well, in that scenario, the father of the girl is the greater in significance in that relationship. That's why he's asking a blessing. Asking to have the blessing upon that marriage. And whenever we use that phrase, do I have your blessing for this? The inherent, what's implicit in that is, you are in some way someone I respect your opinion. You're greater in wisdom, or you're greater in authority, or you're greater in whatever. Maybe it's a child wanting their parents' blessing on something that they do. It's inherent in that idea that the one giving the blessing is superior in some way. And so this was even more true in this particular culture when you're talking about a king. If a king, gives his blessing on a person, he's doing so from a position of authority and power. And so his point then is the lesser person is blessed by the greater. Well, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. So what does that say about Melchizedek?
He's superior.
Right. So in the one case, going back to the Levites, in the one case, the tenth or the tithe is collected by men who die. So talking about the Levites, they're mortal men, yet they collected tithes from the children of Abraham. But in this other case, talking again about Melchizedek, by him who is declared to be living. Now once again, as we talked about last week about those mysterious verses about him having, no mother, no father, no descendants, all that. There are some, to James's point last week, that this particular verse and the verses we read last week lend many to believe that this means that the author of Hebrews is saying that Melchizedek may have been a pre-incarnate form of Christ. This verse kind of reads that way in isolation. In the other case, by him, that is Melchizedek, who is declared to be living, almost makes it sound like he's saying that Melchizedek is still alive at the time he wrote this. And to be fair, there are theologians and commentators who believe that. In the context, what we have been saying, or what I've been saying, I guess I should say, is that these verses are basically setting up an analogy where they represent Christ, but he's not necessarily saying they are Christ. He's saying that Melchizedek is a priest like Christ, but not that he necessarily is Christ. And in that particular way of looking at it, this verse essentially is referring to the fact that the end of the line of Melchizedek is not recorded anywhere. So therefore we could sort of say that the priestly line of Melchizedek still exists at the time, is still valid at the time that he wrote the book of Hebrews, and therefore is a picture of the eternal nature of Christ. Either way, what it means is that Abraham paid a tithe to him, demonstrating his greater significance. So both of these actions, the tithe paid to Melchizedek, the blessing given from Melchizedek, both point to the fact that Abraham saw Melchizedek as greater than him. So, this is where he gets to more or less his conclusion. Verses 9 and 10. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham. Levi was Abraham's descendant, specifically his great-grandson. And then Aaron was his descendant, as were all the priests. So he theoretically paid this tithe to Melchizedek, demonstrating that he was greater than Levi and all the line of priests. Because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Now what this reflects, it's something that's a little odd for us in the 21st century, but this reflects the Jewish belief, it was a cultural thing, that the essence of all of a person's ancestors exists within the body of that person, sort of like the DNA. That even if you're talking about generations down the road, all your descendants sort of exist in you already. So that they would say that Levi, the descendant of Abraham, was in Abraham when Abraham paid the tithe to Melchizedek. Which means that essentially, by the transitive property, I guess, Levi was paying the tithe to Melchizedek too. So once again, he's making this logical progression, and what he's essentially saying is that you guys talk about the greatness of the Levitical priests and how, and the significance of the law and the Levitical priesthood and paying tithes to them. But those Levitical priests, who were the descendants of Abraham, the father of all of us, actually paid tithes through Abraham to Melchizedek. So this means Melchizedek was greater than Abraham, he was greater than Moses, he was greater than Levi, he was greater than Aaron, he was greater than all those Levitical priests that you guys place such importance? Because of paying that tithe and receiving that blessing. So therefore, the order of Melchizedek, that is the priestly line that Melchizedek was a part of, was greater than the Levitical priesthood. So why is that going to be important? Well, that's going to lead into the rest of chapter 7. But again, it leads up to the point is he is going to say that since Christ was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, he was a greater high priest than the Levitical priests, who had to keep going back year after year offering sacrifices, but Jesus' sacrifice was once for all. He was a superior high priest. So that's why he's going through all of these logical machinations, all this theorizing and hypothesizing, to try to lead them to follow his line of logic through the paying of the tithes from the Levitical priests back to Melchizedek. I mean, think about what that's saying. The Levitical priests received tithes, but through Abraham they were paying tithes. And so that is pointing to the greatness of Melchizedek and therefore his priestly line, which Christ was through. Its priestly line. So that's where we're going to leave it today.